here. Excellent. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment, and I'm also going to share the document link in the chat because I understood that some people preferred to have it themselves. So you can look
here for you
in either way in a moment. I just wanted to open by saying, right, we're a few days away from Rosh Hashanah. We've been listening to the I'm just going to mute you, Linda, because there's a little bit of background noise. We're going to, we've been hearing the shofar all month long as part of Elul in our davening in the morning. And I think that one of the pressing concerns of this time of year is about thinking about how to approach teshuvah, right? Like, I think most people, myself, and I'm sure all of you on the phone, we want to do better and improve ourselves and work on our midot and our actions throughout the coming year, but it's not always obvious or evident how to go about doing teshuvah. And so one of the things that I think that the shofar helps us do is helps us think about our teshuvah toolbox, so to speak, right? What are our tools for thinking about teshuvah and how do we go about doing it? So I'm going to hit send here so you can access the link if you prefer, or I will also share my screen. Let's see if that works. Yes, good.
I'm going to
here.
run anything.
So can everyone see either in their own Google Docs or hopefully on my screen? I apologize. I can send it even earlier next time so that we can people can print if they desire. I'm still working out the kinks here.
because you need access.
Uh-oh. It should have said, hold on one second. Anyone with the link can view. That should work. Let's see. Let's try one more time. I'm gonna stop the share for 1 minute. Post this back here. That's not working. That's the same link.
Now it works.
Now it works. Amazing. Sometimes I think there's actually just a lag in the Google. So welcome to everyone who joined us in the last few minutes. We're just about to start the source sheet. I shared it in the comments. I'll share it again in case anyone missed it. And we will, I'm also going to share my screen. So whichever way works better for you is wonderful. And before we start looking at the sources, I just wanted to share a very short personal anecdote that hopefully will resonate about the power of the shofar, just to open us up and get us started thinking. When I was a child, we did tashlich as a community at the local pond, and there was like a forest behind the pond, and often kids would go and play down there, and then you'd go home or to mincha or whatever after tashlich was over. And one year when I was 8 or 9, my cousin and my sister and I emerged from the woods, and my mother was nowhere to be found. And her friend came over and said, like, your mom is so nervous. She's looking everywhere for you. She didn't know where you went. I'm going to take you to shul. And the whole way to shul, she said, remember, girls, just apologize. Just say you're sorry. Like, it was a mistake. Just say you're sorry. And I was like, just say I'm sorry. Just say I'm sorry. And then I saw my mother and I said everything but I'm sorry, 1,000 words, right? But I thought you knew where I was, but I was safe with my cousin, but I was fine. Why were you so worried? And I think that is a very natural human instinct, not only when we're 8, but when we're 38 or even older, right? To fill the space when we're nervous with lots of words. And so that is a tool in our toolkit, right? We do a lot of davening over Rosh Hashanah and the Aseret Yomei Teshuvah and Yom Kippur. And we use all the words that we have available to us to justify, to beg, to reason, to plead with God. But that there is a great power to the silence and to singular words, right? To saying, I'm sorry, and leaving it sort of there and opening up the conversation there. So let's go back to the share screen for anyone who wants that, just to be able to see it with me. So I want to look at the shofar as this toolkit of ours for teshuvah in 3 different ways. So the first way is in just the sound of the shofar in our ears. And I want to look at the Sfat Emet. The Sfat Emet delivered his Divrei Torah, in his shul, and then wrote them down afterwards. And they are organized by year. So in the Sfat Emet for Rosh Hashanah, from the year Taf Reish Lamed Bet, the Sfat Emet talks about the shofar as a kol bli dibur, right? V'zohu hatkiot shehu kol bli dibur, shedibur hu hatchalkot hakol letanoot nifradim v'shonim. Right, that speech or the language represents the division of sound into varied and separate movements. Aval hakol echad miyuchad davuk b'mekoro. But the sound itself is one united, cleaving to its source. V'hayom b'Rosh Hashanah hachayot davok b'shorasho k'nir'eh li kodem hitchalchut v'hishtanot v'rotzin lidvok atzman b'pnimut hachayot k'nir'eh li. Right, on Rosh Hashanah, our life force wants to stick, to cleave to its source, as it was before we became differentiated and divided, and we seek to attach ourselves to that inner flow of life. Right, that speech is confusing, especially right over text or email. Sometimes it's like hard to know what people mean when they say things, but also anyone who's ever done translation work, I know a lot of people here on the call do, know how difficult it is to capture emotions and ideas from one language into another, right? Language has the power to become complicated and convoluted, and the shofar is this undifferentiated sound. It's one sound that cuts through sort of all of the different pieces of language that can make us separate. And the Sfat Emet talks also sort of in a related way, and I think this is maybe one of the most beautiful things I've read about Rosh Hashanah, is about our Nekudah Kedosha. And it's not tied directly to the shofar here, but I think that that they connected throughout some of his writing. So a few years later, there's a piece of the Sfat Emet there that talks about how, right, b'chol ish Yisrael yesh nekudah kedusha belibo, v'hu nishmat chayim, right, that this is like our eternal breath of life. Shne'amar v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu, af b'chol hashana she'mesaglin avonot kol she'hochomer gover u'mechaseh hanekudah, right, that throughout the year, all of our actions, all of the mundane things that we do or our sins, they sort of grow and they cover our Nekudah Kedosha. And I think that, there we go. One of the things that the shofar does, that sound, it speaks right to our Nekudah Kedosha, right? All of the noise that like distracts throughout the year, it gets cut through by the sound of the shofar, and it reminds us of this Nekudah Kedosha. Just like the shofar is like a singular sound, our Nekudah Kedosha is our singular way of being in the world, and they connect to each other. And so the shofar wakes that up for us, and it reminds us, you have this center inside of you that is so pure and so connected, right? That is davuk la Hashem, that is so cleaves to God and to our shoresh, right? So we want to go back to the source, back to the beginning, start fresh and clean, where we can hear our Nekudah Kedosha. And I think that piece of sound is really important in thinking about how we do tshuva. Any thoughts, comments before we move to the second way of thinking about shofar and tshuva?
Well, I just want to say I have found always the sound of the shofar to be very primal. So to me, that resonates with the points that you were just bringing up.
Yes, definitely. It almost, you could like imagine it being the sound of an animal, right? There's like, or that noise that you might make in utter victory or defeat, right? Like the goal noise calling out goal, or also the sobbing of Sisra's mother. Yes, I totally agree. I think it's a very powerful experience. Wonderful. So the second way of thinking about the shofar is reminding us how to do teshuvah, I think comes from the shape of the shofar. So Before we blow shofar, we recite several psukim and tefillot. And one of those psukim, I think, emphasizes the two types of tshuva that we do and that we should contemplate when we listen to the shofar. So the pasuk is from Tehillim, and it's min hametzar karatiya anani b'merchavya, right? That from a narrow place I call out to God, and God answers me and brings me to a wide expanse. So this already echoes the shape of the shofar, right? The part that you put to your mouth is the narrow part, and the sound travels from the narrow and out through the wide expanse of the shofar. Rav Kook writes about this idea in his Moadei HaRe'iyah. So in this side of the page is Rav Kook's language from that book. On the other side, it is not an exact translation. Just to be clear, it is an elaboration from a lovely book called Silver from the Land of Israel, which is writing about the writing of Rav Kook. So it is adapted from Rav Kook, but it is not an exact translation. But I wanted to bring the primary source as well, right? And Rav Kook is commenting, as you can see on this pasuk here, and he also, right? He comments on shofar piv tsar v'holech v'mitrachev, right? That the shofar starts narrow and gets bigger, and then he says derech hatshuva shofar romez alaha lefi divrei Harambam zal. Right, that this is explaining the way that tshuva should work, the way that the Rambam tells us. And the Rambam explains tshuvata prat v'achar kach tshuvata klal. Right, and here I'm going to move to the Silver from the Land of Israel book, because I think the language is very nice. He likens it to the contrast between the prat and the klal, the individual and the collective. Right, there are narrow private issues of the individual, and then there are the broad general concerns of the community and of the nation. The question is, how do we improve not only our own relationship to God and maybe to our families, but also how do we take on the mitzvot or the communal space of the kihila and the tshuva of the kihila? This past Shabbat at the Sudash Lishit that some of us went to, Michael Brooks mentioned, right, that all of the al-chaitz are written in the plural. There is certainly a communal aspect to Shuva at this time of year, right? And so there are like the personal pieces, the personal mitzvot that we take on, but then also these more broad communal concerns of our kihilot. And that's the wide opening at the end of the shofar, according to Rav Kook's understanding of the Rambam and his special piece. And Rav Kook says, Harishonah hakdama l'shniya, right? We have to start with our own personal. And this is certainly the time, this time right now. But then Hatshuva shel Chodesh Elul, right? That's our time. He has Hakdama l'Tshuva shel Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, we start to move from thinking just about our own personal challenges and our own personal tshuva into the broader challenges of our communities. And I am still new here, and I feel like I straddle two communities, one that I know a little better that is now far away in Philadelphia, one that I know here. But I know that piece of it is about coming together around whatever the challenges are of that time, and remembering that our own repentance only works within the framework of the larger picture of the communities that we live in, and that in a lot of ways, I think this dovetails nicely with the idea of the primal sound, right? Is that we have to let the voice of the shofar unite us, and let us come together thinking about how we talk, right? How talking often becomes convoluted, and the sound of the shofar is the unifier, and it can unify varying opinions and concerns and processes of tshuva across the community, because the shofar can cut through all of that distraction and unify us and help us create strong and stable community. And I think that is certainly something beautiful to be aspirational, right? Many of us daven in our own homes during the month of Elul. On Rosh Hashanah, hopefully many of us will be under that big tent together, and we'll be davening feeling as one together. And another different but maybe related point is from the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, which talks also about the shape of the shofar, right? There's a machloket, a debate between two people who, whether the shofar should be curved or whether it should be straight on Rosh Hashanah, and then the opposite shape on Yom Kippur. Right, and so one, Mar Savar, this is Rabbi Yehuda, this is from Sefaria, so the bolded words are the ones actually written in the Hebrew Aramaic side, and the English, the unbolded words are there to help us understand the Gemara in its terseness. So Mar Savar, Barosh Hashanah, Kama Dechayef Inish Da'ate Tfe Ma'ale. Right, so Rabbi Yehuda holds that Rosh Hashanah, the more a person bends his mind and humbles himself by bending in prayer, the better. Right, and so our shofar, and I got a sneak peek of Bob's shofar, which is beautiful and has the curvature, right? That the curved shofar is sounded as an allusion to our bent minds and bodies, and I wouldn't think about it as bent as a too far to the ground, right? It's not about sort of bowing down, but it's about being humble, about acknowledging our role before God at this moment. That we're acknowledging all the things we've done wrong, and that's sort of how we approach that. And right, in fact, when we do the Asham news, many people bend slightly in that way. And I also think that maybe this windy shape of the shofar is thinking about our journeys through life, through tshuva, right? That it's not always as straight and clear as we might desire to identify the thing we need to do tshuva for, and to then, accomplish that and do better. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to see where we're going. And so the power of tshuva at this moment, that the shape of the shofar is reminding us, is that it's okay for our journey to be a little bit windier, and that we can always regain our footing, and we can use our nekuda kadosha, which is being called by the shofar, to sort of get back on our track. And sometimes, right, it's easier to see with more clarity forward and backwards when you step a little bit off the path. You can see further back in that way. And so the idea that our shofar, like our body, or like sort of our brains, the way we think about tshuva, that it can be curved, is a powerful way of thinking about tshuva. I did leave the rest of the Gemara here because, of course, the idea that right, a person should sometimes be straight and pray with simplicity, right? The curving is sometimes like the clutter, and sometimes the straight shofar, or the shofar which is just a little bit curved, reminds us that sometimes it's better to avoid the crookedness, so I would call it the windiness of the tshuva process. But that both of those shapes can clue us into different ways that we do teshuva. And I, again, before we move to the third way, I welcome any thoughts, comments. Well, so the last thing that I wanted us to think about together, and I will admit this is my least well-formed piece myself, and so I really do welcome thoughts and pushback and ideas, is about the idea of listening in and of itself. Right, so the sound of the shofar is that unique, as Kathy said, primal sound that helps us connect. The shape of the shofar reminds us about the way that we approach our path to teshuva. But I think just the very idea, maybe we take it for granted because we know the bracha as so set as, right, lishmoa shofar, is actually really radical in some ways, right? There was a debate way back in history about what the bracha should be. Should it be about lishmoa shofar or litkoa shofar, to blow the shofar? And one of the interesting ways that debate manifests itself is about the question as to whether you can use a stolen shofar. And in that question, right, you can't use a stolen lulav on Sukkot, right, because you can't have a mitzvah that comes from an avera, mitzvah hababa avera. But the shofar seems to be a little bit less straightforward. And the reason is because the Mishabura articulates, right, mitzvat hashofar eno ela hashmiya levad, right? The obligation of shofar, the mitzvah of shofar, is really only in the act of listening, and you can't steal a sound. So you might steal the vehicle to making a sound, but you can't steal the sound itself. And so it becomes clear, right, that this is a mitzvah based on listening. And I think that in a lot of ways that ties both of the earlier pieces together, because the question is, how do you do teshuvah? How do you do personal teshuvah? How do you do communal teshuvah? How do you work to get to that wide expanse together? And the answer, I think, is in the listening, right? As a kid, I had a teacher who said, when your mouth is open, your ears are closed, right? And so if you want to listen, you have to close your mouth. Only like one opening at a time. I'm sure that's not medical, so the doctor should please excuse me. But the idea that we can't talk and listen at the same time, right? And I'm certainly guilty of this. Like, if I'm arguing with Will, I'm like totally not listening to what he's saying. I'm preparing my counter argument. Or how many times my kids like have launched 5 minutes into a story before I'm able to say like, wait a second, I'm actually not listening at all, right? Listening is a hard thing to do. And so although the context of this Mishnah Berurah is about stolen shofarim and the actual obligation, I think it really emphasizes the listening. And so I wanted to share this list. I fell in love with this list when I heard this Dvar Torah in the year 5777, which was 4 or 5 years ago already. Rabbi Ari Hart was at that time one of the associate rabbis at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, where I lived, and he gave this whole Dvar Torah about listening on Rosh Hashanah. But the piece that he talked about shofar, I think, is fascinating. Right? He said, here are 5 tips for good listening. And they are not from a psychologist. They're not from his own like sort of spiritual realm. They're drawn from all the different halachot of the ceremony of shofar blowing. Right. So he lists them out here, and I would love to sort of trace them back, but I was not able to do it before this class. But I'm going to trust Rabbi Hart. I hope you'll join me that these all come from the halachot of shofar blowing. One is to free yourself of distraction. Right? When you come to shofar, you're not doing other things. You can't listen to the shofar while you're catching up on davening. You put everything aside. 2, don't interrupt. Right? We know that we should not talk. People are very machmir about this, right? People with kids stand at the edge of shul so they can whisk their children outside if they start to talk. 3, treat the sound as you are hearing as if it's the most important thing in the world. Right? We really try to focus our whole self. I noticed that often people sort of turn their body to where the shofar blower is. 4, focus to every last utterance, even if it's 100 of them, right? Shofar blowing is long. The first few shofarot are often very exciting and people really feel connected. And by the end, you're like, gosh, I'm really hungry. I wish I could go home. But we have to focus to every last one. And then 5 is to say an intention before you really listen, to get yourself in the proper state of mind. Right. And that I think is beautiful. The intention that we say before shofarot is really important, because getting yourself in the space where you're ready to listen is a process. And of course, that is not going to happen every time you're in conversation with someone else, but especially when you're having a hard conversation, where you're disagreeing l'shem shamayim with someone in your community or your family, right? It's really important to say, well, wait a second, I really want to be able to listen to you. So I'm going to put aside my preconceived notions about what you're going to say or my own feelings on the topic, and that's the way I can truly listen to something. And so I think, right, that when I think back to that story of the tashlich where I just sort of word vomited all over my mother, instead of saying I'm sorry, right, she was able to look past that and to hear the I'm sorry in those words. And maybe that's because she was being a good listener, right? She could have just said, I can't believe you did that, and walked off. But I think that it's also because at this time of year, we know that we have to cut through all the words. So it's better when we can cut through them ourselves, be self-editors, but also to know that, of course, God, all the more patient and loving than a human parent, is able to do that. And so too, we should emulate that when we're the listener, right? When we're the talker, we should emulate the shofar and try to limit our words to the ones that really matter. And when we're the listener, we should remember that we should listen to the shofar or to the person who's talking to us, as though it's the most important thing in the world. And that is a way to accomplish true teshuvah at this time of year. I'm going to stop the share so I can see everyone's wonderful faces again. And again, I welcome thoughts, ideas, questions.
Well, I think that when I hear the shofar, which is similar to those 5 things that you listed, I try to swallow the sound, so I actually internalize it, with the hope that it wakes something up in my brain or soul or whatever you want to say, to try to change something. But it is difficult, but it does take a lot of concentration. But it's definitely a pretty moving experience.
I love that idea of swallowing it, right? Like imagining you opening your mouth, that's beautiful. Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining me for this half hour. I hope you enjoyed it, and we all have a lot to contemplate, and may we all do our tshuva well with the aid of the shofar and the machzor and anything else we need, and have a very productive few days leading up to Rosh Hashanah, and a good Rosh Hashanah and a healthy and sweet New Year. And I look forward to learning again with everyone soon.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Yael. Fantastic.
Very much.
Bye, guys.